Welcome, all of you who join us today for our AQA Deep Dive session. It's quite some time since we had the last one, but it's great to be back. And welcome both previous viewers who have joined us before and new viewers. Just to give you a quick introduction or recap of what Houdin RAQA Deep Dive session is all about. It's that we try to find a topic and really drill down into that, become really nerdy upon something narrow, and discuss that together with an expert. So that's what we do. And the way we deliver this is we try to use approximately 30 to 45 minutes to drill down on this, and we will have this interview in the beginning with the expert. I will very soon introduce him. And then there will be a question and answer session at the end of the deep dive session. To provide us with or send in your question, you could simply hover down in the bottom of the screen, and there will be a Q&A symbol. I think it says Q&A or questions and answers as well. Simply submit your question, and you can do that at any time. We will save it until the end of the session. So don't be shy. And if you're shy, you can ask for a friend. Yeah, I think that's it. Well, one more thing before we get started. Yeah, that's that we're going to send, after the session, we're going to send out the material and a short summary. And this is a recorded session as well, so you can watch this over and over again. And we'll also send a survey, and we really appreciate if you take that survey. It takes like 2 minutes. And also propose topics where you want us to nerd in on. So without further ado, welcome Mr. Nicholas Wells from UK.
Thank you very much, Marcus. So yeah, and welcome to everyone else who's joining. So thank you very much for taking the time to actually come and listen to some hopeful insights that I'll provide. And thank you, Marcus, for inviting me.
Tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, we've only got 30 minutes, haven't we?
Yeah.
So
we can skip the golfing.
Yeah, that's the interesting bit. No, my background is regulatory affairs, and it always has been. So that's nearly coming up to 25 years now. And got into that from university. So I've always had an interest in science and fell into regulatory affairs. So from the work world, that's all I've known. I've started right from the beginning, as a junior position, and worked my way up to senior global leads in big pharma companies, and now have my own consultancy where I try to help people who are bringing their products to market, and who are looking for some strategic advice, but also, which is why I'm here today, is we provide regulatory intelligence. So yeah, we do a lot of work in that field, working with a number of clients, and also we have like an online platform as well, which is growing, and we're looking at version 2 soon to release. So that's something maybe if we get onto it we can talk about, but obviously we're not here just to talk about that. So that's really where I am. I'm from the UK. It's raining as it is, I know, in Sweden. But yeah, and quite closely aligned with the EU. I was over in Rotterdam last week with Topra. So we despite Brexit, Marcus, we're still part of Europe.
You're hanging in there.
We're here. I'm happy to help, European countries as well as the UK.
Yeah, great. So regulatory intelligence, that's your main expertise, more or less, or your arena, which is great, because today we're going to talk about from regulatory data to actionable insights. And that's a very, I wouldn't say a very narrow and nerdy topic, but we will make it narrow and nerdy. But let's define what do we mean when we talk about a massive amount of regulatory data and using that for, well, let's call it data-driven insights or data-driven decision making. What's your definition, Nick?
So you're right, it is a huge area, and a very often overlooked area as well. So with so much information coming in, I don't know, maybe some people just rely on, you know, the most important pieces of information coming their way, but that's not quite, from our experience, how it works. So the way we, without going into too much detail, the way we see it is that you need to be continually monitoring the key areas for your business and for the areas that your business focuses on. And we will, obviously, I imagine we'll be going into that in more detail, but it's kind of having that ability to differentiate what is important and what's not important to you. And of course, that comes from experience, but it also comes from having the right tools in place to do it, and processes in place. But yeah, without it, you're lost. And a lot of people don't really take that on board. They sometimes, in my experience, a smaller company will see it as a nice to have, because they think, well, we've only got 3 or 4 products, or 1 or 2 products, or whatever it might be. And, you know, and we're part of this group, we subscribe to each month. They should be telling us, you know, and it's kind of often overlooked and not seen as a priority.
Yeah. And you know, I used to make the simile that to participate the game, you need to understand the rules of the game. So if you enter a soccer game and all of a sudden you start to pick up the ball with your hands, you will get a penalty, right? And this is the same thing, to make it very simple. You have to understand the game to avoid the penalties. The penalties might be stressful moments. It could be really penalties. It could be lost revenues. It could be a lot of things. This is a new question that popped my brain, so it's not in my script really. But is it overlooked, this area, due to the fact that companies have made, you know, taking on everyday penalties as a normal thing?
So I guess the first thing to do is differentiate penalties versus loss of revenue. So
Yeah,
the penalty
when I
side of
said
things,
penalties, I meant like,
and I think it's a fair question, because outside of the area of regulatory affairs, and let's say more broadly outside of the area of pharmaceuticals, you probably think that there are huge fines, and this is what keeps you in check and makes you compliant. And of course, obviously, yeah, there can be penalties, there can be restrictions, but really it comes down to, if your product is either off the market for a particular reason, or you're later to the market, and you know, as a company like yourself with shareholders, you know the importance of making sure that you deliver to those promises that you're making. So I think that's really where we have to distinguish first. As to whether or not companies kind of accept, if that was your question, or they at least, you know, take it as the norm. Some do. Some are more proactive than others, which maybe we'll come to later. But that reactive versus proactive part of companies, I've seen a lot. And yes, the ones that are more reactive, kind of just accept that, oh, it's going to take us this long to develop the product, or because there's these changes coming, or whatever it might be, rather than landscape, you know, looking on the horizon and seeing what's coming down the road and being very prepared for it. And of course, it comes down to resources as well, Marcus. Like any business, it's easier when you've got deep pockets to throw at these things.
It is. I'm just going to fill in. I think it's very interesting that you mentioned and distinguish the behavior between reactive and proactive. There is a strong correlation between business success and being proactive in every aspect. And funnily, I read this article a couple of weeks ago that was regarding regulatory affairs and quality assurance and product development. And if they work proactively in every part, and that, you know, that's the business culture, those companies are the ones you find Fortune 500. So there is a correlation for both avoiding risks and becoming successful when working that way. But let's leave that and think about one other thing you said when you defined you know, the term regulatory data to actionable insights. There's a lot of information out there, and information keeps changing all the time, and there are new updates, new guidances, new versions of regulations on all the markets where you sell your product. So every regulatory, I mean, let's say it's 100 per week globally. I think that's pretty close to reality. Let's say then that every update could feel relevant and urgent, but not all have the same impact. So how do we really distinguish between a minor change and one that could significantly disrupt market access or cause
Yeah,
a penalty?
a penalty. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a great question. And there are, as they say in England, there is more than one way to skin a cat. Not sure where that term comes from, but the
Sweden,
way,
probably.
yeah, maybe. The way we handle this for our clients that we provide services to, is that we've created what, like a matrix type triaging system. You can call it one or the other, I don't mind. I haven't come up with a trademark name for ours yet, but yeah, we have a system where, despite how much experience we have, we still need to get around a table and look at each change or update to a piece of guidance or whatever it might be, and then we list it, and we use a system, quite a simple system, which is why we use it, because most people understand it, is the who, what, why, when, and how terminology. And without going into too much detail now with how we do that, as you can understand, we don't, if we would say how, well, let's go with when, because that's probably the most important.
Yeah.
We look at when is the question. When is this impact? When is this change going to take effect? Now, that's the key thing, really, because obviously everything works back from there. Then, when you're going to start making, adapting your processes to, or whatever it is that you have to do to manage this change. So you were looking at the when, and then that's just one example. And then if we were looking at the how, which is another big one, is, well, how on earth are we going to handle this change? Have we got the resources in house to do it, or do we need to be factoring in someone, external help, not just to help us understand the change? Maybe it might be for some companies. So we look at it that way, and we put it into our grid, our matrix, and then we also then give it a color coding. I prefer a 1 to 5, but we've kind of landed at a color coding, and that, for particular clients that we work with, we would pull them in and say, look, we explain to them, this is the change, this is what's coming, this is the how, when, what, why, and this is a little summary of what it is, and this is how we think it will impact you. Let's come to a decision on what we agree on. Do we both agree it's a red, or we both agree it's a green? And then we can then start strategizing around that, how we're going to plan for that change, what we need to do, because we can go into more detail, but it might be something like when you talked about market access, it might be, well, let's not focus on these markets because we know that we're not going to be able to make this change in time. So let's focus our attention on these markets, which we always knew we were looking at, but it's a lower hanging fruit. We can go for those first. So that's kind of how we do it.
I don't know if you mentioned in the beginning when you presented yourself, but I happen to know that you mainly work with pharmaceuticals. So maybe an applicable list of regulations is not as important for a pharmaceutical because the regulations are not that many. Of course, there are different per country, region, and so forth. But would an applicable list be a good first filter for a pharmaceutical, or would that apply more to medical devices and IVD products? Since they might, for an IVD product, it might be up till maybe 9, even 10 different regulations on EU level. And then you have 7 per country within the European Union. And then you have 5 to 10 for countries in Europe, but outside the European Union. And all of a sudden you have more than 100 regulations that needs to, first of all, filter out any regulation change. So you have to be aware, okay, there's a change and it relates to a regulation we have on our applicable list. So that's like a first very what do you call it, a filter that removes the noise of regulatory changes?
I think, and I know in the past we've talked about you know, the nuance between pharma, which is my bread and butter, my background, and medical devices, which there's a lot of focus on now. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes over the last 3, 4, 5 years. But the way, again, from within the industry, within the regulatory industry, if you want to call it that, there's an underlying expectation that we know which regulations or which legislation is relevant for our markets. So we kind of we don't generally speak in that way about, oh, directive, whatever it might be, you know, is changing. We would talk about the change, whatever it might be, you know, the latest electronic product information change. We wouldn't then relate that back to the particular piece of legislation. But that said, when it comes to, and you're right, I didn't mention my company in too much detail, but when I think of my regulatory intelligence company and the platform that we use, we do monitor it more on a legislation directive level, and we're looking at those changes, and then it's down to us to interpret those into a more an easier to digest language for our clients and the people within those teams. So, but you're right, you do have the, as the analogy we've used before, the library. You're in the library with all of those pieces of legislation as books that, you know, you have to be aware of them all. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, an applicable list of regulation could be useful for some, and for you who have it all in your head, you just know how to navigate it. It all depends on, you know, who you are and how you work with things. So, okay, that was a fine answer regarding how to distinguish what is most important and what is the least important and what is not important. But let's say that you've identified a regulatory change. What would you say would be the key factors to assess when determining its potential risk to product compliance or market entrance?
Yeah, so I wonder whether it might be worth thinking of an example to give for that, because it's a good question. I mean, geography is probably one of the key. I know I talked about the timing, but let's, you know, there's always going to be a time element to a change. So, but then from a company point of view, geographically, you have to consider which markets that's going to affect for you, and then therefore which of those markets are key revenue drivers for you. So that kind of helps you determine what your focus would be on if you were going to be putting resource to, you know, being prepared for a particular change or an update that's coming. So geography definitely would be one. Let's think of some other things. I guess, yeah, timings. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, is it an immediate thing, or can we kind of park this for the moment and then, you know, focus on something else, but be aware of this, and maybe then think about how we're going to put a team in place and start building, you know, putting together a team, or at least having a key person in charge of doing that. That would be another one. And then, is it going to impact on market entry, I guess, is another thing. Or you could also swing it to, is it going to have an impact on product already on the market? Because those two massive drivers from a commercial point of view. Because what you have to remember is, in regulatory, we get like, oh, we must build a regulatory strategy, this is so important. But really, the regulatory strategy feeds into the wider business strategy, or at least should do. And it's what comes first. But you know, a switched on business will be working very closely with regulatory, because I don't, you know, we always say this in regulatory, we're not trying to say how wonderful we are, but if you're sat in regulatory, you have input into so many different departments within a business, which is not necessarily the same if you're sat in marketing, or if you're sat in commercial, or whatever, where the other or you know, operations. It's not, you know, it's not the same. So yeah, we need to be, you know, we need to make sure that we're engaging as early as possible with the right people.
Yeah,
because that can decide it. Sorry, I was going to say, Mark, that can decide
exactly. Yeah,
what they, because then suddenly they're saying, well, yeah, okay, actually you've said that's important because of the timing, but actually we're more interested in these markets, and anything that's going to negatively impact where we go with those markets, that's what we're focusing on as a business, and they can readjust our thinking because of that.
Yeah. So let's get even more narrow. Do you have like a real life example where overlooked regulatory update cost challenges or even delays or maybe even penalties? And what did you and that company learn from that experience, if you have one?
I have.
I bet you have plenty.
I
Not
have
that you
some,
have been involved with, but a friend of yours.
yeah, friend of mine. Yeah, there's a few. There are also some more positive ones as well. So it's not always where we've missed it. And I say we, obviously I'm speaking, in the third person there. It's not me, definitely.
Yeah.
But where something's been maybe overlooked or not considered as important. But there's also those where good planning, as examples of good planning, is in place, and that saved them time and mostly money is what it saved them. So the bad one first, I guess. Then we've worked with a client who has not considered a particular change, and this is around nitrosamines, which have been a big thing where you have to risk assess the different nitrosamines in your products. And what wasn't considered by this client before us, I hasten to add, but I'm hopeful we would advise them in this way, but they hadn't considered the assessment of this, not just in the excipients and the API in their product, the active ingredient in their product. They hadn't considered it in relation to the production of that.
Oh.
So in their manufacturing and their production of their products. So therefore, when the time came when they should have submitted all of their risk assessments and their analysis and their data to back up why their product's compliant and it meets the limits, they were then firefighting and trying to provide the relevant information. Worst case scenario is obviously that a marketing authorization could be sort of not withdrawn, but they could have been told to you cannot market it until you provide us with this data. But the reality is that it just meant that there was a lot of running around and screaming and trying to get things fixed. And if they had read the guidance properly, or if they had been advised properly, then that would have been avoided. So there's an example of a real life example of where a company has then had to spend a lot more money than they needed to, and they were rushing around, and time was being taken away from other areas that they could have been focusing on.
Yeah, and other mistakes that happens probably.
Yeah. And these things do happen, but it's just the better prepared you are, then the less likely that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then and a positive, I guess, example is this was a friend with a client, and they have a lot of resource. So I'd love to be providing them with regulatory intelligence, but they do it in-house, so they're very well prepared. But they were adapting and setting up key teams, whatever else they needed to, cross-party teams for all of the Brexit transitions and the post-Brexit things that have occurred since. So they not only were ready and they had everything in place and there were no delays for them, and it meant a lot of work, but they were able to kind of pull in the resources for projects early and get the right people in, even though they were like limited time projects. They were able to get the right people in early, and there was no real stress other than things kept changing in the actual regulations and what they were going to do. But at least they had the team in place to listen to when, as soon as the government decided they wanted to change things even more, or whatever it might be, or the timings were going to change, they had a team in place to react to that, and like a Brexit transition team. And then, but the other thing which is key to that, Marcus, is that not only were they able to react to that, they were able to take advantage of things that they knew were coming, like the international recognition procedure in the UK, where UK regulators, able to take the US, for example, and Australia, and kind of do the mutual recognition of the approvals, and be more prepared for that. And see it on the horizon and think, where are opportunities with our existing products that we might be able to bring to the market quicker in the UK now. So that all comes from good regulatory intelligence, good monitoring, and good dissemination of that actionable intelligence, which is what we
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking of one thing. I mean, if we take the first company and the less positive situation that or struggle they had with compliance, and the other company that they are obviously very proactive and have good advisory and a very good team running it, and realizes that regulatory is something that happens throughout the entire company from sourcing to sales. Would you say that the relationship with the regulatory body and if you have a notified body becomes somewhat of a troublesome if you are not proactive? And, it's consuming more of their time and it's harder to communicate with them and so forth. When could that have a long-term effect, maybe, that you have a less good relationship with?
Yeah. The short answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
Back in the day, it used to be emphasized to us, because in those days you would pick up the phone and speak to an assessor, and you would have a bit of a relationship and you'd build a rapport, and it was very important to keep that and to build that good relationship between you and the authority. So, and the bigger your company is, the more. I can't say for certain, Marcus, that it does have an impact, but I can imagine that if you're seen in a negative light, it doesn't help you, put it that way.
Yeah.
So, obviously regulators are impartial, and, their role is to, take things as they see it and act in that way. But I think it's damaging to your company's reputation, particularly if you went for like a real extreme example where an error or a mistake or something that was overlooked ended up getting into the press, and then obviously that's going to have an impact on the company share price, which is not good. And that could, that does happen. It's not
That does happen. I was just thinking that if you recognize someone that makes a mistake, you scrutinize that person or company in this case much more the next time, just because there's a little bit of a flag that says that, well, these people are making mistakes every now and then. Let's have a closer look.
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question that we could look at another day, is that how, as regulatory bodies change with the invent of AI and the progress of AI.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. It's very narrow, but still big.
Because to take it to your point, if you know that a client or a marketing authorization holder produces very good quality clinical expert reports, and they always are in the same format, and they're very well written and they're very well received, and it's easy for the assessor to read, that's a dream come true for that assessor, is that they know what they're going to get, and it's very easy to them to see where things are not what they would expect. So from that, but that shouldn't sway anything from the point of the regulator. They still have to read every piece of information and interpret it, but they probably it's made a lot clearer to them by certain people. It's a lot easier to read and understand, let's put it that way. But how AI will treat that in the future, I don't know, but that's another discussion for another day.
It is.
That should be 100% impartial.
That's going to be a topic for a deep dive session at some point in time, definitely. So when it comes to risk classification, we talked about reactive and proactive quite some, but I just wanted to, return to that just for a short time. So how would you say that you can balance between being reactive and proactive? Because you probably can't be proactive all the time and for everything.
So going right back to what we first said, I guess from that point of view, is you don't need to do anything, but it would help you very much to have in place a system, a triage system, whether you use the version that we use, the matrix that we use, and if anyone is interested in that, by the way, I'm happy to talk more about that, but we'd have to do that today. But I might even have an example of it that I could share, of how we do that. But having that in place will enable you as a company to get to that perfect place that you all hope to be, is where you are proactive all the time. And then when something does come out of the blue, because you're prepared for all the other things that are coming, you have the ability to react to those moments where it does, because they still come, and in the shortened time frames, or there's something urgent that comes that affects your company. But because you are, you've seen what else is coming down the road, you maybe have got the ability to adapt more quickly to those changes. So the key step is obviously having something in place. You need to be horizon scanning. You need to have some kind of monitoring system in place, whether you do it in-house or whether you outsource that to someone else that can help you do that. Regardless of size, if you're in this game, you need to have that. As we go back to your analogy of the game, you need to have that as one of the tools that you need to have in this game, so that you know what you're doing.
Exactly. You don't want to see
what you're doing. Yeah, it means you have the ability to react, and then you might have to get someone in that knows what they're doing. But yeah, at least you're aware.
Either
of
is
something.
fine. You simply don't want to have a notified body doing this sign every time you do something.
Exactly. Yeah, you certainly don't want the notified body or the marketing or the agency telling you about a change that you've missed. Let's put it that way.
Then you're reactive.
Then you are reacting. Yeah.
Then you're late. But we are not late. We're looking into the future. And that's one way of being narrow and thinking of what we have ahead of us. What I've seen over the last couple of years is that the regulatory environment is constantly evolving, is moving faster and faster, and it has to, because the innovation is moving faster. So new laws and new regulation and legislations and guidances must come at a higher frequencies. And that causes a challenge. So how can organizations build flexible decision framework that ensures that they can capture and that they can adapt without sacrificing market timelines or compliance for that sake?
Yeah.
Big question. Long question.
It's a big question. The part about rapidly evolving is very topical, because last week I told you I was at this TOPRA symposium in Rotterdam, which was great, and it was a mixture of networking and a mixture of listening to what's coming down the road, which is obviously what is important to me and for my clients. And things are so rapidly evolving. It won't surprise you to know, Marcus, that the majority of the discussion was, well, not the majority, but certain elements of discussion brought in AI and talked about that. And there was an actual topic on this, on the teams that they've set up and the current guidance that they put in place around AI. And it just straight away, the question which I put out to the group, and they did try and answer it as best they can. It was how are you going to evolve legislation as quickly as the technology that's evolving at ridiculously rapid rates? Now, in fairness, it might relate to what we're answering here. He did say it was more around not going into the minutiae of the detail. It's having the policy in place, or at least the pillars in place that aren't going to change regardless of how quickly the AI changes. It's fundamental things that you need to be having in place to stop the whatever your concerns are, or to make sure things aren't running away from you, because the technology is changing quicker than your legislation can keep up. So I guess, again, that bringing that back to how we can do that in the world of regulatory intelligence and monitoring. Well, I guess having that framework in place, the matrix, but not just the matrix, the team that will be reviewing your triaging, your analysis, having that team in place to start with, even if it's regulatory, safety, and medical. The three, or but as you evolve, it will obviously include commercial and other teams and quality. But having some structure in place so that you are able to see it coming, work out what you're going to do with regards to it if it's important, and then action in it and getting out there and doing something. If you haven't got that in place, then you're always going to be fighting. It's always going to be firefighting.
So automations would be important, and monitoring would be important, and having the correct setup of the right resources being available to perform the analysis and implications of change. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and building those into company procedures, processes.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, you must have those. They're another thing that's easy to overlook with the smaller companies, myself included. You know, we have to think about our own processes in our company and getting those in place. So yeah, so having that, and one of the things that I know you guys are probably thinking about, because you've got more resources than I have, but that's kind of analyzing the data that you have already seen. So like trend analysis,
Yeah, exactly.
which I don't know how easy that would be for people to do, but the more data that's available, and with the tools that are available these days, I imagine it is achievable for companies. Either they do it themselves, or there's platforms maybe that you're developing that you want to enable a bit of analysis to be done.
For sure, we have some terabytes of regulatory data and literature and so on, and there's opportunities.
Yeah, yeah.
And what you're saying now, that applies. I mean, we're talking about regulatory intelligence, changes regarding regulations, and all the documents that is related to regulation. That's where we're at right now. But what you just said, that applies to all the post-market and pharmacovigilance operations as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
I mean, so if you once have it in place for one area, you could make use of that for the post-market and pharmacovigilance purposes as well.
Yeah, and it's a regulated industry, full stop. So it affects all areas, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
inside it.
But
So
what I'm saying is that you don't have to build. Ultimately, you wouldn't have to build that architecture for various purposes. You could build one architecture and make use of that for pretty much a 360 360, well, this is quoting our tagline, 360 surveillance, intelligence, and vigilance purpose.
but as we've discussed, though, that is for me, that's obvious and an ideal,
Yeah.
but the way that things have evolved, they've evolved at different times. So obviously the safety element in the world of pharmaceuticals, biotech, and the areas that I mostly work in, you know, that was seen as a more important, shall we say, critical area for development. So that developed sooner as its own thing. And then obviously regulatory intelligence and then regulatory policy, that kind of, from my experiences, is, you know, I'm going back 25 years, that kind of evolved separately and more slowly to becoming where it is now. Some might argue that have been involved in that since the beginning. They might argue with me about that, but I would say that more focus was put on safety and PV and post-marketing for obvious reasons, and therefore, but the ideal would be for a company to have, you know, a process for monitoring changes and things relevant to that.
Yeah.
You know, with one system rather than having a, you know, a big group of people looking at it in different ways, you know, in different departments.
Yeah. Great. The future is exciting. A lot of AI, a lot of great technologies that you could apply on pretty much all of the areas where someone within the regulatory or quality assurance team has the task to stay up to date and retrieve a lot of important information to update periodic safety update reports or PMS reports, or updating the regulatory landscape or the regulatory intelligence report and so forth.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
and having a good architecture in time that doesn't necessarily have to shoot against efficiency, but it will make you more proactive, and it will, you know, in this sense, efficiency drives quality. Yeah. I think it's time to open up for questions. Do we have any? People are stunned.
We've done such a
Here
grand
comes
job.
well, here
Covered
comes
everything.
one. Here comes one. How do we ensure that risk classification aligns across multiple regions with differing regulations, especially when a change might be high risk in one market but low risk in another?
That is so that's when you need to sit down and consider which markets, so the where, which markets does this affect? And then when you've decided on that, you can then decide, it might be that you classify it based on market level. So when we talked earlier, I said about we give it a color coding or a number coding based on the change. Well, it might be that you actually are classifying it for the US market. It's a red. We know this might be coming as well for Canada now, or whatever, you know, so therefore it's an orange or whatever, or it's a 3 instead of a 5. Yeah, so that's probably, you would need to break the change down to either product area, it might be, or you know, it might be products, or you might want to break it down to markets, or both.
Yeah.
But that's where the expertise comes in, I think, and that's why you need to sit around a table once you start triaging it.
And there's a lot of stuff that factors into that equation, and I think that's a good opportunity or good situation where when you need to discuss it a little bit. There's no clear answers really, or it's hard to define them. So one more, and this fits well into my last question to you, which was regarding future technologies. What tools or technologies have you found, I assume you as Nick, found most efficient in staying ahead of regulatory updates and making faster, more accurate risk classifications or decisions? It doesn't have to be risk classifications.
Yeah, well, one of the tools that we've used won't come as too much surprise, but has been Houdin, and it's been
I heard about that. Seems to be fairly good.
That too has evolved over time, but it's always had the core functionality for us to be able to monitor the correct sources that we need, either for our company Reg Intel, so that we can provide our reports for people, or through the consultancy, so that for our clients, making sure that we are monitoring the correct sources and producing the correct reports, regulatory intelligence reports for those clients. So that would be that bit. And then on the classification side of things, we didn't find anything that particularly worked that suited our needs. So we created our own matrix tool, which we use, which is not overly fancy, but it does what we need it to do. And it's, we can use it for whichever client we want to use it for. So they're just two tools. Yeah, there are lots out there, Marcus, as I'm sure you will know because you've done your market research. But it's whether or not they deliver what you need.
And the follow-up. This is my own question. A follow-up on that. I think most of the viewers of this webinar have tried AI, most likely ChatGPT or Gemini or any other AI that is available, and that is fairly good. Tell me, how do you make use of AI today? Just one example.
AI helps. It helps, but it doesn't solve the problems, let's just say. So I've used it. Simple ways I've used it are around content and around assisting me with content for delivering information to people to talk to them about regulatory intelligence. But that's just a basic way. We've looked into it, using it as a tool for helping us to understand, or at least give a different opinion on a change that might be coming, and how that, if we did a scenario, if we were talking about scenario planning, if we put in a scenario of this is an organization that has this product in these areas, and how might this impact them, these are our thoughts on how it will, what might we not have considered, those sorts of things. But I wouldn't rely on it. It's trained on, it's not trained on expertise that's in here. It's trained on publicly available, mainly information that's never going to quite have that degree of sort of understanding or knowledge that we gain over the years of working.
No, exactly. And you have a narrative that in your question, that where so much about a certain client, a certain product, that the AI, it's very hard to create that fantastic prompt so that the AI can talk about that only, or provide answers and implications regarding a change in relation to that product and all the other information that is evolving around that. So it's tricky, but it's interesting to hear how people make use of AI, because we find our own small hacks every now and then and find it useful for, as an assistant. And AI is an assistant. It's not a problem solver. Then that is something else. And it might come. There might be trained models on regulatory. There might be trained models on literature analysis and so forth. So very interesting. I can give you one hack, one AI hack that I do from time to time. There's a saying that you need to be able to speak to farmers in a farmer's language and speak to hymen and hymens, or what do you call it? How do you say this in English? Do you know the saying, Nick?
No, not yet. I'm waiting for it. I'm still.
It's in Swedish. It's like, if you want to make impact on farmers, you need to, if you're speaking to farmers, you have to speak the way farmers do. And if you're to make impact on a priest or that, you have to speak as a priest does.
Yes.
And this is where AI comes really handy. So if you write a regulatory essay or an executive summary of a couple of changes, piece of a report in a regulatory lingo, it's designed for being read by a regulatory person. So what you can do is you can take that text, toss it into ChatGPT and say, okay, so rewrite this text so that it would suit a person who works within marketing in this company and so forth. Because what happens then is it transfers the context and the narrative of the storytelling into the world of a marketing person and twists the effects of a change towards what marketing is usually responsible for. Hence, the receiver of the information will embrace it and understand it more likely. So that's a little bit of a hack.
No, that's very good. Thanks.
Let's see here. There's more. Here's one more great answer. AI is good for support, but keep the conclusions for humans. A layman's term. Yeah, that was a comment. Let's see if there are any other questions. Nope, not yet. Feel free to. I mean, we're actually over those 45 minutes now, and we start a little bit late. But if there aren't any questions, we could stop here. And if you like usual, 5 minutes after the webinar, the great question pops your mind, send it to us. We will provide you with handouts, a short summary of today's session. There will be a recorded version, and that you will be able to see over and over again, share with friends, and so forth. And if we will reply on the answers, questions and answers. If you have one, send it in, and we'll toss it into the summary as well. So you mentioned ChatGPT and Gemini. How about Perplexity? Have not tried. Have you tried it, Nick? Perplexity.
No, I'm still with ChatGPT at the moment.
There's tons of AIs popping up right now. There's a great initiative in the US by one of the Microsoft founders. I can't recall who it was. Either way, I can add this information in the handouts as well. But what they're doing is that they build AI models similar to GTP models, similar to the way OpenAI make use of AI, but they do it for scientific purposes only, for life sciences, for farming, combining weather with grapes or crops and so on, to try to predict what can happen and how to prevent from various scenarios early on. So they have this massive initiative going on there with specifically scientifically trained AI models. So let's see, there's a final question coming in. Perplexity AI gives its sources where ChatGPT does not. Okay, yeah, that's a good thing.
On that point though, so I haven't tried Perplexity, but I did. Is it Consensus? That's like a built-in part of ChatGPT, and that does allow you to look at it from a sort of scientific report side of things. So I just out of curiosity, I ran something through it recently and asked it to give me the sources as well, and it did. The only thing with that is that you don't know how well it firstly how it's only as good as your key search terms that you put in for it to do the literature review type exercise. But it certainly did pull out some relevant, from what I could see, there were relevant sources. So it was able to do that. I wouldn't rely on it, and I certainly wouldn't be submitting it to an agency, but it was a start at least. So it kind of picked out a few things that are relevant.
The problem with AI when it comes to those kind of exercises is that there always a time gap between the latest trained model in terms of what data it has gone through. Most often and that gap is shrinking all the time, but it won't be real time for quite some time. I will say it might not even ever occur, and that's a problem, you know, when you're trying to use AI for literature review, for example, and saying that I ran this through this model, but there's a time gap of 6 months. And that's a pretty big time gap, especially when it comes to literature or regulatory, even worse, right?
It needs to be up to the minute. Really.
So I think the combination of a real-time monitoring system that will retrieve the fresh information for you, and then run it to AI. So you have already selected the right sources, and then you take that and run it through AI to get implications or analysis of any kind is a much more more effective and safer solution that you could validate for a regulatory body and that they would understand and rely upon.
Totally
great. I'd say that will be the thanks for the question, dear audience, and thank you for being with us. We will be back. I have a feeling that it will be more about AI in the next session.
And if you get any questions, Marcus, feel free to forward them on. You know, I'm
I will for sure. With that said, thank you so much, Nick, for joining us today, and thank you all of you who was here live, and thank you all who view this the recorded version. Please share it with friends and family. Shared knowledge is better knowledge, and stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.